There are records inside the United States government that until very recently, no member of the public was ever meant to read. Not because they contained proof of anything, but because they contained the opposite. They contained questions the people who filed them could not answer. And in the spring and summer of 2026, the government began releasing those records anyway, batch by batch, onto a public website. Most of what came out could eventually be explained. Weather, aircraft, reflections, camera artifacts, but a portion of it could not. And within that portion, a single shape keeps appearing again and again. Not a saucer, not a triangle, a sphere, a glowing orb. And in the most documented cases, an orb that does something no balloon, no drone, and no aircraft is supposed to do. It produces other orbs. What makes these particular files difficult to set aside is who reported them. These are not anonymous accounts pulled from a forum at 2 in the morning. These are sworn federal agents, active duty soldiers, and witnesses interviewed directly by the FBI. People trained to observe, to estimate distance, to describe what is in front of them without embellishment. And when the official analysis came back, the conclusion in the most striking cases was a single word: unresolved. In this video, we're going to walk through 5 of those cases, 5 separate sightings, drawn from the Pentagon's own declassified material, where the object behaved like nothing in the conventional inventory of the sky. Cases where the witnesses agreed with one another almost word for word, where the investigators ran every ordinary explanation they had, and where the file, in the end, was closed without an answer. Case 1. The Mother Orb and the 6 federal agents. In October of 2023, in the western United States, near a location the government will only describe as a sensitive national security site, 6 federal law enforcement agents reported the same thing on the same nights. They were not standing together in a single group looking at a single point. They observed from different positions, at different angles, over a span of hours. And yet when their accounts were collected and compared, the descriptions lined up almost exactly. What they described was a large, glowing orange sphere that would appear above the terrain. The agents began calling it the Mother Orb because of what it did next. According to the released summary, the orange sphere would hang in the air for as little as 1 or 2 seconds, and in that brief window, it would release a cluster of smaller red orbs. 2 of them. Sometimes 3. Sometimes 4. And then the orange sphere would simply be gone. The smaller red orbs that it left behind did not drift or fall the way a flare or an ember would. They moved. Investigators recorded the witnesses describing coordinated horizontal motion, sudden changes in altitude, and what one analyst characterized as varied flight profiles that did not match any single known object. One of the agents told investigators that the smaller orbs looked as though they were being hatched out of the larger, very bright orange light. He said it happened over and over, and that he lost count somewhere after the 5th time. Another agent reached for the most ordinary comparison he could find and described the smaller orbs as looking like grapes being squeezed out of a basketball. At one point during the encounter, one of the agents turned to the partner beside him and asked simply whether the partner was seeing this too. There was no video, no photographs. In several of these cases, the witnesses were federal officers who did not have a phone in hand at the moment it mattered, which is a detail that keeps recurring across these files. What there was instead was a body of consistent, independent human testimony, and the agencies took it seriously enough to run a full analysis. The All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, the office the Pentagon stood up specifically to investigate these phenomena, compared the witness accounts against commercial and military flight logs, against radar data, against spatial estimates, and against ADS-B transponder records, the system that tracks where aircraft actually are. They considered military aircraft. They considered drones. They considered classified U.S. government programs. They considered foreign intelligence activity. They considered ordinary environmental phenomena. Military aircraft had in fact been conducting exercises in the area, and some of them had deployed flares, and the analysts concluded that flare activity could plausibly account for a meaningful portion of what was reported. They assessed that foreign adversary technology was highly unlikely, but no single explanation covered the whole event. And when the math was done, the office concluded that roughly 40% of the reported activity could not be explained. The case was judged to warrant continued investigation. In other words, it was left open. Case 2. The Western U.S. event. The mother orb sighting did not exist in isolation. When investigators assembled the full record from that corridor in the western United States, they found that it was only one piece of something larger. They grouped 4 related incidents together under a single heading, the Western U.S. event, and it became, by their own description, the most extensively documented unresolved case in the entire release. Inside that file were 5 separate witness narratives, hand sketches drawn by the people who were there, and a notional map laying out where each thing had been seen. The 4 incidents were each given their own plain, almost clinical label. There was the one already described, orbs launching orbs. There was a second event the investigators called the fiery orb, and then there were 2 more, named not for their color, but for their shape, because the witnesses described them moving in a way that did not look spherical at all. One was labeled the dark kite, the other the translucent kite. This is the detail that tends to stay with people. The same general area, the same window of time, producing not one kind of anomaly, but several. Bright orange spheres that spawned red ones, a burning object, and 2 objects that observers compared to kites, one dark and one see-through, holding position or drifting in the night sky in a way that nobody could attach to an aircraft. The witnesses who reported the red orbs described them accelerating instantly and arranging themselves into a clean, horizontal formation, moving with a coordination that several of them struggled to put into words. The Pentagon, reviewing everything it held, singled out the law enforcement orb footage from this corridor as being among the most compelling material in its possession. That is a strong word for an institution that spends most of its time explaining sightings away, and it raises the obvious question that the file itself does not answer. If these were flares or drones or some misread piece of training activity, why were so many trained, independent observers looking from different angles, describing the same impossible behavior? And why, after all the radar and all the flight logs and all the cross-checking, was the most thorough case in the batch the one the government could least account for? If you find this kind of question worth sitting with, it's worth following along to the end, because the pattern that ties these 5 cases together only becomes clear once you've seen all of them. Case 3. The object over Cheyenne Mountain. To understand why this next case carries the weight it does, you have to understand where it happened. Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado is not an ordinary mountain. Buried inside it is the operations complex associated with NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, the organization responsible for watching the skies over the United States and Canada for exactly this kind of thing. Anything unidentified in the air over North America is, in a sense, NORAD's entire job. So an unidentified object hovering directly above the mountain that houses it is not a small matter. In February of 2022, 5 members of the U.S. Army reported seeing precisely that. A shimmering object holding position above Cheyenne Mountain in clear daylight for as long as 3 minutes. The way they described it is unusual enough that it deserves to be repeated carefully. They said it was roughly the size of a large jet. They said it was shaped like a potato, irregular, with distinct edges, not symmetrical in any direction. They said its surface looked painted in a creamy, whitish opalescent color, somewhat translucent, with a faint shimmer to it, and they said the surface appeared to be made of overlapping segments, that one of them compared to articulating fish scales, panels that shifted and rearranged themselves slightly, while the object itself stayed completely still. It did not fly off. It did not maneuver. It simply hovered, shimmering, for about 2 minutes by their account, and then it vanished in an instant. As with the federal agents in the West, none of the 5 soldiers had a phone on them. There is no video, and there are no photographs. There is only the testimony of 5 trained personnel and a sketch produced afterward to capture what they saw. The case was sent up for analysis, and an intelligence community partner offered an explanation, but offered it with what they themselves labeled low confidence. The proposed answer was something called sunlight backscattering. The idea was that light from the sun, reflecting off the snow on Cheyenne Mountain, might have illuminated the underside of low clouds in a way that produced the strange shape. It is a plausible-sounding mechanism on paper. The problem, according to the men who were there, is that they remembered a clear and cloudless day. With no clouds, there is nothing for the reflected light to illuminate. The explanation was filed anyway, marked low confidence, and the case, as of the latest release, remains unresolved. Case 4. The red sphere with the plasma center. The next 2 cases move from the deserts and mountains of the West to the forests of the northeastern United States, and they move from soldiers and federal agents to ordinary people interviewed by the FBI. The first of them took place in July of 2025. A witness arrived home one night and, as they parked, noticed an intense bright light hovering below the tree line behind a residence. Not high in the sky. Low, close, just behind the trees. According to the FBI interview, the witness described it as a red sphere, roughly 1 meter across, and said they had never seen anything that particular shade of red before. At the center of the sphere was something they could only describe as a white plasma sun, a brilliant glowing core about the size of a basketball, sitting inside the red. This is the kind of account that would be easy to dismiss if it had come from a single person. It did not. A second witness, separately, came outside and reported seeing the same object. The FBI recorded their estimates carefully. The object was about 30 yards away. It sat roughly 20 to 30 feet above the ground. And then, according to both witnesses, a second identical orb appeared near the first. The 2 of them moved together above the trees. They changed altitude. They changed direction. They traveled in tandem, in a way the witnesses described as smooth and silent, as if the 2 objects were flying in formation or somehow tethered to one another. And then, before disappearing from view, the 2 orbs appeared to merge into a single object. Cell phone footage of 2 glowing red orbs moving over the wooded area exists and was released by the government under the file name Northeastern Orb Sighting. It is worth being honest about the limits of that footage. It shows 2 bright points of light against a dark sky. It does not, on its own, prove what they were. Skeptics have pointed out that bright lights over trees can have mundane sources, but the file does not rest on the footage alone. It rests on 2 independent witnesses, interviewed by federal agents, describing a 1-meter red sphere with a plasma core at close range, in agreement with one another, and on investigators who took the account seriously enough to formally record and release it, rather than throw it out. Case 5. The yellow orbs that combined. The 5th case comes from the same general region of the Northeast and from the same year, 2025, and it was again documented through an FBI interview. But the object here was different in color and in behavior, and that difference is part of why it stands on its own rather than being folded into the previous case. The witness in this report described seeing a yellow ball of light, glowing, about the size of a basketball in the evening sky. After getting out of their car for a clearer view, they saw a second ball of light nearby. This one was larger, closer in size to a beach ball. And then, as the witness watched, the two yellow orbs did something that has no ordinary aerial explanation. They came together. They combined into one, and then they were gone. What makes this case notable is not just the description, but what the investigators did with it. According to the released material, the government did not simply leave the explanation open-ended. It actively worked through the obvious candidates and set them aside. The analysis discarded the idea that the witness had misidentified military aircraft. It judged that the objects were unlikely to have been unmanned aerial vehicles, the drones that account for so many modern sightings. It considered foreign intelligence activity and found it improbable, and it considered ordinary meteorological phenomena and found that unlikely as well. One by one, the conventional answers were examined and judged not to fit. And the region these reports came from is not new to this. Investigators noted that similar accounts of glowing, plasma-like spheres have emerged from the same part of the Northeast over a span of years, including a separate October 2024 incident within 25 miles of the others, in which a luminous, shape-shifting sphere hovered above a pond for roughly 45 minutes before vanishing. What ties these 5 cases together? Taken one at a time, every single one of these cases has a door-marked exit. Military exercises in the West really did put flares in the sky, and flares can be mistaken for orbs. Sunlight on snow really can do strange things to clouds. Bright lights over a dark forest really can be misjudged for distance and size. The individual explanations are not hard to construct, and in fairness to the people who write these reports, they constructed them. What is harder to explain is the shape of the whole. The first thing that stands out is who the witnesses are. These are not the usual anonymous reports. They are sworn federal law enforcement officers, active duty Army personnel, and civilians who agreed to sit down and be formally interviewed by the FBI. These are people with professional reputations, people trained to observe carefully, who in many cases had nothing to gain and something to lose by describing an object that should not exist. When that kind of witness reports something, the bar for dismissing it should be higher, not lower. The second thing is the consistency, both within each case and across them. 6 agents in the West describing the same orange sphere from 6 different angles. 2 witnesses in the Northeast independently describing the same red sphere with the same plasma core. And then, across cases separated by thousands of miles and several years, the same impossible signature appearing over and over. A larger orb that releases smaller orbs. Orbs that move in coordinated formation. Orbs that change direction and altitude with no visible means of doing so. And orbs that merge together into one before they disappear. These are not vague impressions of a light in the sky. They are specific, repeated behaviors, and they recur in the testimony of people who had no way of comparing notes with one another. The third thing is the official response, and this may be the most telling pattern of all. In case after case, the government did not deny that something was reported. It acknowledged the sighting. It ran a serious analysis. It lined up the conventional explanations. And then it attached a label that quietly admits the explanation did not hold. Low confidence, highly unlikely, unresolved, roughly 40% unexplained. The file is opened, the analysis is performed, the ordinary answers are offered, and the case is closed without actually being solved. The anomaly is documented, and then, in effect, set down. And there is a fourth thing worth naming directly. For decades, this entire category of experience lived in the informal world, in pilot break room conversations, in reports that never went anywhere, in accounts that the people who filed them were quietly encouraged not to repeat. What changed in 2026 is that the formal record finally moved toward the informal one. The government built a public system, the Presidential Unsealing and Reporting System for UAP encounters, and began putting these files where anyone could read them. It released the witness narratives, it released the sketches, it released the analyses, including the parts that admit failure. That shift, from concealment to disclosure, is itself part of the story, because it tells you the institutions involved no longer believe they can simply explain all of this away. None of this is proof of anything beyond what the documents actually say. The Pentagon has been clear that it has found no confirmed evidence of extraterrestrial technology, and the responsible position is to hold that line. These are unidentified phenomena, and unidentified is not the same as alien. But unidentified is also not the same as nothing. When trained federal agents, soldiers standing in the shadow of the nation's aerospace command, and FBI witnesses across the country all describe a glowing sphere that produces, coordinates, and absorbs other spheres, and when the government's own analysts run every ordinary answer and still close the file with the word unresolved, the honest thing to do is to sit with the gap rather than paper over it. So that is the question these 5 cases leave behind. The objects appeared. The witnesses were credible. The investigations were real. The conventional explanations were tried. And in the cases that mattered most, they did not fit. The files are now public, and they are still marked open, which leaves the only question that actually matters. If the people whose job is to identify what flies over the United States looked carefully at these orbs and admitted they could not, then what exactly were 6 federal agents watching that night in the West when the orange light opened and the smaller ones came out?